So Captain America is the reason Wolverine and Deadpool exist in Marvel Comics. And longtime readers of Marvel already know this. But for you new folks, this is going to blow your mind. So this follows an actual timeline, right? World War II, the Cold War, Deadpool. So the thing about this is it all goes back to three scientists, right? These guys by the name of Abraham Erskine, Eric Schmidt, and Hans Bruder. Now, most of you guys know Abraham Erskine as the guy who developed the super soldier serum, but it wasn't just him. And in fact, these three guys worked in Germany for the German government as part of something called Project Nietzsche, which was Germany's attempt to develop super soldiers before the Americans could. Eventually, Erskine and these guys learned what the German government's going to do with super soldiers, and so they defect. Specifically, Erskine is extracted from Germany by Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos, and he's brought over to the States to begin work on a Weapons Plus project called Project Rebirth. Now, what is Weapons Plus? Because you guys know Project Rebirth is like the Captain America project, right? So Weapons Plus was a government program. And the idea behind this is that it was just Americans developing super soldiers. Now, publicly, Weapons Plus was just a super soldier program that the government had in order to build super soldiers to fight the Axis powers. And that was it. The secret reality behind Weapons Plus went back to a guy named John Sublime. For those of you guys who are familiar with Marvel and Daniel Way's Wolverine Origins run, we're ignoring everything with Romulus because honestly, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But John Sublime was this guy who would realize the credible threat of the mutant population. And there's other stuff that goes into it, but for this discussion, that's what matters most. And John Sublime had basically founded or established Weapons Plus as a way to create super soldiers to contain and control the mutant population. And so when Abraham Erskine is brought over to the States, that Abraham Erskine begins work on Project Rebirth, that Steve Rogers is chosen, he is injected with the serum, he's put in a Vita Ray chamber, he's blasted with Vita Rays, he comes out, becomes Captain America, and the rest is history, right? Wrong. So the way this worked, the way this was supposed to work, is that if Steve Rogers proved himself to be successful in World War II, which as we know, he for the most part did, he would have been brought back to the States by Weapons Plus, his mind would have been wiped, he would have been given false memories, and he would have gone forward as the first in a new line of super soldiers designed to contain and control the mutant population, at the very least within the United States, but eventually on a global scale. Such as it was, Captain America was believed to have been dead, but he was frozen in a block of ice and all that kind of good stuff. Here's the kicker about all of this. Between the time that Steve Rogers became Captain America and the time that he was frozen in a block of ice, one of the campaigns that he was involved in during World War II involved the Wakandans. And what ended up happening is Steve Rogers, alongside Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos, traveled to Africa in order to help repel the German invasion led by Rommel. That whole campaign saw them introduced to T'Chaka, the father of T'Challa, and the Wakandans as a whole. And so between the forces of Captain America, Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos, and the Wakandans, the German invasion in Africa was basically pushed back. And as a show of thanks, Captain America was given a small sample of vibranium by T'Chaka. So Captain America comes back to the States and he tells the federal government, make me a new shield that includes this vibranium, but also make the shield round. And they say, why do we make it round? And he says, because I saw people using round shields. And yes, they could use them defensively for blocking attacks and so on and so forth, but they could also throw them and they could be used offensively. So that's why Captain America's shield's round. So the whole shield project for Captain America is handed over to a contractor working for the US government named Myron McLean. And just like the discovery for penicillin, this dude literally falls asleep during the process. And when he wakes up, he ends up discovering he had accidentally created this new metal alloy that went on to become Captain America's shield. And so in his efforts to duplicate it, he discovered two things. One, he could not duplicate the shield, and two, he had accidentally created a new metal, also known as adamantium. Now, what was also going on during this time of World War II is that over in the Auschwitz camp, a villain by the name of Mr. Sinister was experimenting on mutants that had been captured by the German government. Now, that'll be something that we're going to come back to here in a second, but I want you to keep it in the back of your head because it will be important. But as we also know, at the end of World War II, Steve Rogers was frozen in a block of ice, but he was believed to have been dead. What this meant was that for Weapons Plus, they could not go forward with their plan for Captain Captain America, and they couldn't duplicate the super soldier serum because Abraham Erskine was dead. So they basically had to restart all over again. And so what they did is they created a series of new projects, weapons 2 through 9. And so what these did is they saw things like animals being experimented on. Guys like Luke Cage, for example, got his powers from Weapons Plus as part of these weapon programs. But all this coincided with the actions of a guy named Truett Hudson. Truett Hudson was a US advisor to the federal government, but Truett Hudson had traveled to the different camps that existed under the German government in World War II, and he found the journals of Mr. Sinister, where he had literally notated all the different experiments that he had performed on mutants. And that's where Truett Hudson came to the idea, why are we creating super soldiers out of like regular people when we can just create super soldiers out of mutants? We have all this information about how like their genes work and all that stuff. So Truett Hudson comes back to the States and he spearheads the creation of the 10th program under Weapons Plus, also known as Weapon X. Now, around the time that he's doing this, specifically we're in the 1960s at this point, there's a group called Team X, and these guys were a wet work team. Basically, their missions involved bloodshed, but it was the Cold War, right? So these guys toppled communist governments, they toppled political opponents, executions, assassinations, the whole 9 yards, everything you could think of. But Team X was composed of Wolverine, Sabretooth, Mastodon, Kestrel, Silver Fox, Maverick. There were some pretty solid guys out there. But with this group operating as an arm of Weapons Plus, Truett Hudson said, let's just bring them into the Weapon X project. Because at that point in time, under Weapons Plus, they were already getting their memories wiped and replaced with new memories on a regular basis. So they never really even knew what their actual history was. And so it's not that much of a stretch to modify their memories to make them just more docile and make the transition easier to bring them into the Weapon X project. But when they're brought in, Myron McClane is brought back in order to basically create more adamantium, which is already difficult to do. But enough adamantium is created that it's bonded to Wolverine's skeleton because of its healing factor. Wolverine goes forward, he escapes the facility, he ends up joining Canada's Alpha Flight, and then eventually becomes part of the X-Men. The kicker about all this is that because of the success of Wolverine, albeit the fact that he escaped, Weapon X had become much bigger than any of the other weapons projects, so much so that while it was still quote unquote under the umbrella of Weapons Plus, it kind of wasn't. It was basically its own thing. At that point in time, the first version of Weapon X was already a joint venture between the United States CIA and Canada's Department H, and using the Department of Agriculture as like a cover, so nobody really knew what was actually going on there. But even though the original iteration of Weapon X went defunct, it was eventually brought back, and the Weapon X 2.0 program, if we can give it that name, became a joint venture between the CIA and Canada's Department K, and that ultimately you saw the introduction of Wade Wilson, Deadpool. I mean, technically he was a mercenary because he'd been dishonorably discharged from the US government, but developing cancer and then seeking a cure, word had reached his ears that there were these miraculous abilities, up in Canada somewhere. And so the guy goes up there, he's brought into the second iteration of Weapon X. The healing factor of Wolverine is put onto Deadpool, and then through a combination of his own story as well as just the nonsensical nature of Deadpool's comics, that he ultimately ends up developing a healing factor that is way beyond Wolverine, as well as like a love interest in Mistress Death. Like he literally almost dies and Mistress Death brings him back to life. It's kind of crazy. But the fact remains here, right? Like that's how all these guys are connected through Captain America. Had there never been a Steve Rogers, there would be no Wolverine and there would be no Deadpool. So it's one of these cool things, these cool plot threads that run through all of Marvel Comics. But with that being said, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments about videos like this, and I will catch you all later. Peace.